Donnie and Dolly. The team is supported by ableauctions.ca. Closing your business? We can help.
Friday, and all of our guests today brought to you by Delaney, and that includes Thomas Drance, nursing his sore ankle down in California. Brought to you by Delaney's OK Tire in Langley. In business for over 20 years, OK Tire is Canadian-owned and operated from coast to coast. Clayton and Brett Delaney are second-generation owners, and they handle all the major tire brands, as well as custom wheels and suspension, leveling kits and lifts and full mechanical services. You get an oil change there. Visit them at 19863 Fraser Highway in Langley. Stanley Cup Final starts tomorrow, Sunrise, Florida. Panthers and Oilers here to talk about that. And yes, Ryan? Looks like you were confused. We got Thomas, and we'll talk about the Canucks as well with Thomas Drance in California. How are you, sir?
Doing well, gentlemen. Thank you for having me.
Well, this is a bit disappointing. You're in California. Last week we had the holiday shirt and the hat. The sun hat, and now this is. Does this have something
disappointing
to do with your injury, Thomas?
Yeah, I'm set up where I can keep my foot elevated and on ice as I wait for the swelling and the bruising to go down. I haven't been moving around a lot the last couple of days, gentlemen.
Yeah, it was a hiking incident for people who don't know, right?
Yeah. I was up on a trail, a desert trail, so I was basically on a cliff face. So I couldn't fall in the direction that I was actually falling. I had to twerk my weight to fall safely uphill, and just completely twerked my ankle. It's a sprain. I can hear the ligaments popping. It'll be fine in a few days, I hope.
Could have been worse.
Yeah.
Okay,
Could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, Game 1 Stanley Cup Final tomorrow in Florida. If the Oilers end up winning this series, Thomas, what will that say about the Vancouver Canucks?
I don't think that much, to be totally honest with you. I mean, we know what the Canucks are, right? We know that the Canucks are a sturdy team, sort of among the fringe contenders, certainly a top 10 team in the NHL. And I think they played like it in that in that series against the Edmonton Oilers. I think, the way that it ended superficially makes it feel like the Canucks were, I think, closer in quality to the Oilers than they really were. And I think that's context we have to keep in mind, and that presumably this management group has to keep in mind here. I mean, I've heard Rick Tocchet in both of his appearances talk about, the missed opportunities, the things that he's regretting, the coulda, woulda, shoulda of that Game 1 loss, the idea of the first period. You wonder if that Mikheyev miss looms large in his imagination. I'd imagine it would, based on him isolating the first period as sort of the moment that the team lost the game, not the second period, and on as the club, surrendered a 3-0 lead to the Oilers. Here's the simple fact of the matter, right? The Canucks had 2 chances to advance to the Western Conference Final, and in those 2 games, they were outshot 56-32, meaning they averaged 16 shots a game in those 2 contests. And until 8 minutes remaining in Game 7, where they launched a comeback attempt, that fell short against the Oilers, they were outscored 8-1 and then 8-3 on aggregate across those 2 games. I mean, at the pointy end of that series, the Oilers put their boot down in a way that made it really, really clear who the superior team was, I think. And I think it's important for this club to process that, right? I think it's important for everybody sort of watching this team and thinking about what the summer should look like to process that and realize that, what was accomplished this season was nothing short of remarkable, especially with the year-over-year defensive turnaround, right? The Canucks now, and they have to be protective of it a little bit given all the defensemen that they have expiring, plus Lindholm, plus Dakota Joshua. I mean, key contributors to what this team was able to accomplish two-way. But the foundations are set for this team to be an elite defensive team. And yet, you go into the playoffs and year after year, you see what happens to LA, right? You see what happens to Carolina, right? And then you see who the Stanley Cup winners are the last few years, right? And it's the high-flying Colorado Avalanche, right? It's the Tampa Bay Lightning with what they can do on the power play and with Nikita Kucherov, right? Cooking teams. It's what Vegas did, changing their game, by the way, from an elite defensive team that relied on physicality and overwhelming control of the 5-on-5 game to become this lethal rush attacking team with Jack Eichel leading the charge. I mean, you look at Edmonton and Florida, and whoever wins the Cup this year will apply as well. you need that extra layer of ability to manufacture offense when you're faced with elite opposition late into May, early June. And I think that's ultimately where the Canucks fell short against the Oilers, despite, getting .866 goaltending from the Stuart Skinner, Calvin Pickard combo. When it mattered, chips down, chance to push the Oilers off the cliff and out of the postseason. Vancouver across 2 games was able to muster, 3 goals and 16 shots a game. I mean, that's where I still think there's a pretty sizable gap between the Oilers, the Panthers, and where the Canucks are at, and a gap that the club will have an opportunity to address this summer, given their cap space.
Thomas, yesterday a lot of Zadorov talk in the market. Some say he's close, some say he's far. I mean,
How'd that happen, Rick?
Never mind. What are your thoughts on Zadorov? What the heck is going on?
Well, so really quickly on Zadorov, the idea that Zadorov has liked it so much that he might stay. I mean, what a reversal from where, everyone was 6 weeks into his Canucks tenure, right? The way that he's become viewed as essential, the way he's come to view this organization and this market as a place that he'd like to be, I think that's a testament to his performance, not just in the postseason, but down the stretch as well. Zadorov is a high-quality defensive driver. He does some loud things with the puck, and he'll chase hits, which makes people think that he's like a high-risk defender. But truly, his defensive impact throughout his career has been the most reliable attribute of his game 5-on-5. I'm a huge fan of the player. Like, at the end of the day, if you don't like a 6'6" monster truck of a human being who takes chances with the puck, shoots hard, and lays people out, like, what are you doing? You're watching the wrong sport. Like, this is everything that's good about hockey wrapped up in one individual, and that's without even getting into the quotes. That's even without even getting into his status as a fan favorite and a quote machine. So, if you can keep Zadorov on a reasonable AAV, because I do think it's important to note that while he played, top 4 minutes for the Canucks in the playoffs, for most of his career, he's been more in that 4-5 mold, right? There is an element to which you wonder if he's a bit redundant with Carson Soucy. Like, do you already have the tall 4-5 type defenseman locked up here? And yet, for players that profile like Zadorov, especially with the size, right? I mean, it's atypical to be as large and as broad as he is as a defenseman in the NHL. And the Myers experience that we just saw this past year sort of gives me some pause. Like, you think about how long Zdeno Chara played for. You think about how long, guys like Mike Komisarek, guys like Hal Gill were able to stick around in this league. You look at free agency, like guys over 6'4" who are still capable defensemen. You'll find guys like Brendan Dillon and, like these really gigantic defenders seem like they actually kind of quietly have a longer shelf life than, a 6'1" hardworking Carl Alsner type two-way defenseman. That to me would almost present an argument where if you could keep the AAV manageable in exchange for term, which we all know is a priority for Zadorov, I think there's a way to get a fair deal done. It'll look risky the day it's signed, but again, I mean, if you're going to gamble on a guy to age a little better than other people, like one thing that doesn't diminish with age is your size. You're the same size forever. So, provided you don't do like I do and eat dinner like it's your last meal. Zadorov's sort of an interesting one for me because I can absolutely see the case, especially if there's a way to move on term and manage the AAV for the club to do a fair deal with him. And yet, I do think this club has to be really conscious and careful of doing enough to preserve their edges, right? With their center depth, especially, their bottom six center depth, the quality defensive presences that Bluger and Lindholm represent in the bottom six. And of course, some of that size and defensive IQ on the back end. I think they have to be protective of that, but they have to be protective of it at the right price. Cause I don't think you can take too much ammunition, out of your holster in terms of what weapons need to be fired at upgrading this club's offensive attack this summer.
Well, what did you think? What did you make of the coaching changes? Yogi Sevskoski in there, Manny Malhotra in Abbotsford. We didn't see any of this happening. Like nobody thought we'd have a new coach in Abbotsford and a new coach in Vancouver. What's going on there?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, for sure, clearly with Abbotsford, and you can see it with the way that they've signed players too. I mean, you remember the first summer, Rick, when Abbotsford relocated, and it was like Kyle Burrows and Sheldon Dries and Sheldon Rempal and like all the,
Nick Patan,
like all these expensive quad A guys, who are on like one-way contracts at $750K. And, one thing I think you've seen with how this Canucks team has filled out their roster in Abbotsford is, they've been a little bit more conscious of managing it in a like sustainable way from a budgetary perspective. And by the way, that's totally fine. That's what you want to do to make sure that hockey succeeds in the Valley forever, right? Like that's how you have to do it, in my view. And so that's made Abbotsford more of a developmental stop. And, I think those seeds are visible in moving off, one of the top coaches in the American League and replacing him with really sharp, experienced hockey guy like Malhotra, who has never been a head coach at the professional level. I mean, there's certainly a budget case to be made to what shaped that decision. And then with Yo, I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but the optics look a little bit similar to me in that you are sort of moving off of a head coach, an assistant coach who's been a head coach in two separate stops and replacing him with a guy who, has never been consistently on a bench in Yogi Shevkovsky. He's never been on a bench full time as an assistant, even above the major junior level, right? Like he was occasionally on the bench on Don Hayes' staff, but certainly the experience gap between him and Mike Yeo is a chasm, which isn't to say that, Shevkovsky or Malhotra aren't sharp. It's not to say that they're not going to grow into these roles. It's not even to say that they're not going to be upgrades. They absolutely could be. But there is, a diminishment in the overall experience level of Rick Tocchet's staff. And, that's something that the club is going to have to manage. I'd just add that, the club made some decisions behind the bench over the course of the past 18 months that I sort of side-eyed a little bit, that I sort of reacted to with some skepticism, whether it's Rick Tocchet personally managing the power play, a pretty unique situation around the league, having assistant coaches who are part-time. There's not a lot of situations like the one that Sergei Gonchar inhabits in Vancouver. And yet no one would have watched how organized this team was and said anything other than that they were one of the best coached outfits in the league, right? One of the most overachieving, well-organized, prepared teams in the NHL last season, despite things like despite things being structured a bit unconventionally. So, I think this is I'm sure there's some element to which budget is at least a benefit of taking this approach, right? I'm sure that's at least part of the thinking, but you're also promoting smart hockey guys, and given this coaching staff's track record here, I think we cut them the benefit of the doubt on sort of their ability to make it all work, despite the experience lost and the quality coaches lost with Colleton and Yeo moving on to other opportunities.
Okay, this has got to be really quick, Thomas. Florida, Oilers. Who do you pick? And Elliot Friedman said the other day that he thinks with some sustained on-ice success, which they haven't really had a lot of, that Florida, Sunrise, the Miami area can become the same type of market, successful market that Tampa Bay is. What do you think?
I hope so. I would love that. I think the arena location remains a real problem. Tampa Bay's arena is right downtown. There's been tons of revitalization around it. Florida, out in Sunrise, that's still a tough nut to crack, especially, you're a back-to-back Stanley Cup finalist team that's also won the President's Trophy in the last 3 years. I'm sure that helps, but I ultimately do think to be sustainable in that market, and, it's not different from the Ottawa market, by the way, right? I do think a location in downtown Fort Lauderdale or downtown Palm Beach, I'm in Palm Springs, so I got confused momentarily, or downtown Miami, I do think that's essential, and ideally, honestly, further north. Like I do think Palm Beach or somewhere in Broward in terms of Fort Lauderdale. I think that would be the location. But I do think ultimately that that's going to be required to like really cement the Panthers as like a Nashville Predators style Sunbelt success story. But man, it's awesome to see how energized that market is. Mike McDaniel going to the game and saying talking about how excited he is at the Dolphins presser. That sort of stuff. Given the amount of time I spent banging my head against a wall in that market earlier in my career, I love to see the success that they're having. And I think they're going to win the Cup this year. I do. I think they're going to beat the Oilers. I think their pressure game, I think their speed, In fact, I think they're positioned to do some of what worked against Edmonton for Vancouver, but at a higher level and with more offensive push. We saw how Vancouver's forecheck played, as they came back in game 1, early in game 3, certainly in game 5, the one game in that series that Vancouver really dominated from nose to tail. I think the Panthers are well set up, well built to mimic some of what that worked, but maybe even do it at a higher level and also capitalize on a higher degree of their opportunities. So I'm going to pick Florida, and I think Florida is going to be able to get it done. I'll pick it in 6, but I won't be stunned if it's in 5 or 6.
Take care of that ankle, Thomas.
Thank you, gentlemen. Cheers.